Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for Nate. You're not going to believe what I learned last weekend. Apparently, when God was giving Moses the Ten Commandments, there was a third tablet that actually read Armchair ESG, greatest podcast that ever was, has been, or will be. So we've got it from the house.
Sacrilege, sacrilege.
Now, once again, Armchair ESG with me, my partner in crime, Mr. Nate Gerard, our head of product. How are you doing today, Nate?
I'm good. We're recording on a Tuesday. It feels kind of odd. Usually, this is my cue that the weekend is coming, right? So this is really going to screw me up today.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
Um, And then for all of the fans of the show, really stoked when we have a guest. We try to get that guest back as quickly as possible. So once again, and she has actually asked me to not reread her entire bio, focusing on the work with coral reefs and the scuba diving aspect. Judy McNary. Judy, how are you doing today?
Doing well. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, our pleasure. Thank you for coming back. It was a wonderful discussion, and that dovetails into our other guests. We're really excited. So Judy, when you were on, we were talking about sort of ESG as a success story and where it's already working out. And we really got into some of your work with the coral reefs, the oceans, where you've seen some positive change and where you have some concerns. And you wanted to bring someone back on who could really talk about this. So I'm really, really happy we have Dr. Helen Fox. So right now, and I'm going to read this just to make sure I get it right, but the Conservation Science Director of the Coral Reef Alliance, coral reef ecologist by training, well over 20 years experience working at the boundary of science and conservation, which is a very interesting intersection and an important one, I think. Um, because if we are trying to conserve things in a way that's not actually helping, then what are we really doing? You work to promote networks of reefs, including the genetic and ecological diversity, to provide reefs with the best chance to survive climate change. Prior to that, you were with the developed the field engagement component of the Allen Coral Atlas Partnership at the National Geographic Society, and you still remain active in that partnership. You've been the senior director for Changing Planet Grants at the I guess that's also National Geographic Society, principal of Fox Conservation, Senior Director of Research at Monitoring at RARE, and Director of Marine Sciences at the World Wildlife Foundation US, where you co founded a research initiative to examine links between marine protected areas management and governance, ecological impacts, and human well being in Indonesia and globally. You have a PhD in integrative biology from UC Berkeley.
Integrative biology.
Integrative.
It's non-fundable biology, they like to joke.
I know the word, I just can't talk right now. Integrative biology from UC Berkeley in 2002, investigating coral reef recovery and rehabilitation from blast fishing in Indonesia. Numerous grants, numerous awards, more than 50 scientific publications, more than 1,000 dives, and once lived underwater for 9 days in the Aquarius habitat. So that is the first part that I highlighted when you sent me over the bio. You got to tell us about that to start.
I will
Nine
do.
days.
All right. Well, and I don't know if you want to edit it, but it's World Wildlife Fund, not Foundation. World Wildlife Fund US. I didn't write it out, but yeah. So the Aquarius habitat, I chalk that up to a once in a lifetime lucky break that I got. I was in grad school. My advisor, Professor Roy Caldwell at Berkeley, was actually the lead for the expedition, and it was to study stomatopods, which are mantis shrimp. They're decapod crustaceans. They're 10-legged crustaceans like shrimps and lobsters. So they're related to that, but they have these like raptorial appendages. They've actually gotten some internet fame. So you can check out the stomatopod or mantis shrimp. But anyway, so there, I was supposed to be leading the day boat expedition, but I was basically the backup for the saturation mission. And then at the last minute, Dr. Caldwell didn't get medical clearance. And so they went to the backup, and that was me. And so I felt terrible for Roy because he didn't get to go, but I was very grateful because it was amazing. It was like living, the size of the habitat is basically like a school bus. So you imagine a underwater
Wow.
school bus boated to, anchored to the sea, bolted to the sea floor. And
Wow.
so we would go out and do mapping of stomatopod habitats on Scuba and wearing double tanks. And then they had like a little triple decker stack bunk to sleep. And they had portholes, and so you would look out and see fish swimming by. So it was very cool.
That's amazing.
It
How
was
far
awesome.
down
No,
was it?
it's
Yeah, it's so the sea floor that it's bolted on is about 60 feet deep, and the habitat itself is up on, not stilts, but posts, columns, and that's at about 45 feet deep. And then we were going out deeper than 100 feet to map these deep water habitats. And so basically, as Judy knows, when you're diving, when you're scuba diving, you have to monitor how much nitrogen you have, and that's why you can't stay too deep too long unless you're up at 100%, and that's why it's called saturation diving. So we were basically saturated with nitrogen, and so then we had a very slow process where they then basically oxygenated the environment as we were preparing to leave the habitat.
Is that like gas bubbles in your blood and the bends? And I don't know much.
Exactly.
Yeah, just really quickly, is this the same? I guess there's only one in the world like this, right? This Aquarius habitat, right?
Aquarius, I think so. There have been a couple others over time, and I'm not even sure of the status of the habitat. At the time I did it, it was part of UNC Wilmington, and
Okay.
astronauts trained there and things like that. So I have,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say, so Garrett Reisman was an astronaut, I think, that stayed under there for 2 weeks as well. And he has an episode on the Joe Rogan podcast. I remember as soon as I read that, I said, hey, and I went and found the episode of him comparing being up in space and being under the ocean. And it was a very interesting, it was the first time I'd ever heard of the Aquarius. They call it the Aquarius Reef Base, I guess, is what
Yeah,
they
I
put
think
it
they
in the
did maybe
title.
with its
Yeah.
new owners. Yeah, that's entirely
Yeah.
possible.
That's
It's
amazing. He
off
has
of
some
Key
crazy
Largo
stories.
in Florida.
That's right. That's it. That's it. And he tells, because you have to swim out to go to the bathroom, right? Is that right?
Yes, you
And
do.
so he tells a crazy story about how at night he swam out to go to the restroom. On the way back, he saw something like glowing and it freaked him. He just swam as fast as he could back to the habitat. And I was just thinking, man, you are one brave man, space and the bottom of the ocean. So that's really cool. That's awesome that you got to do that. So,
Yeah, no,
You
I'm very grateful.
mentioned you mentioned space. We
yeah,
know like significantly more about the surface of the moon than we do the bottom of the ocean.
that's
And
right.
then Helen, you're talking about you're studying stomatopods, this one very specific element in this massive ecosystem that counts the biological ecosystem, the feedback system that our oceans and the air have together. I really want to talk about issues impacting our oceans. How do you even think about the enormity of all these things? And also, like we talk about the forest for the trees, this is the oceans for the stomatopods, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So, well, just a couple things. Um, so Sylvia Earle, who is, her deepness, she's an amazing legend. And I think it's back to the Aquarius, headed up the first all-female aquanaut mission, like well before my time. But she, in terms of talking about the difference in like how much we know about space versus the ocean, I remember her giving a talk where she said the statistic of like our exploratory powers, it's probably improved now, but when she gave the talk was like the equivalent of having one Jeep for the entire terrestrial part of the US. So imagine like what we would know if we only had one Jeep to try to understand everything. So there is a lot that we don't know about the ocean. And the other fun fact that I learned from one of my friends in grad school, or whatever, little quips, was that this person who studied deep ocean cephalopods, squids and octopus, is like, I could fund my entire research work for the cost of one space toilet. Like we invest so
Oh,
heavily in exploring outer space, and the ocean is so important. Inner space is something else it's called, and we just don't invest in it nearly as much. Um, but sort of back to like big picture about the ocean, it's super important. It feeds us, it regulates our climate. Most of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the ocean. And it's also the foundation for much of the world's economy. So I don't study stomatopods anymore. And even then I didn't. It was just a little a little side project because my advisor, Roy Caldwell, studied stomatopods. I focus much more now on coral reefs and sort of big picture threats to corals and what we can do. And so a way of, and I actually was involved in a project, I think the paper came out in 2007. So again, this is from a while ago, looking at what are the major threats to different habitats. So Ben Halpern at NC's was the lead on this project. And basically I brought an expert working group and did a lot of data analysis, but things boil down to three big threats. Pollution, and that includes issues like water quality, sewage, problems like that, plastics, overfishing and destructive fishing. Sorry, I didn't catch that. You say?
You're good. You're good.
Okay, sorry, I just heard something.
Overfishing and destructive fishing.
Yeah, overfishing and destructive fishing. And so, yeah, for my PhD, I was studying blast fishing in Indonesia. And then the third one is climate change, and that includes increased water temperatures, changes in pH, ocean warming, ocean acidification.
So blast fishing, as in dynamite blast fishing,
as in dynamite or bombs, yeah. So that's what I looked at for my dissertation research, was the impacts of dynamite fishing or bomb fishing in Indonesia, and it was an illegal practice, but it was very difficult to regulate, and so it was introduced in many areas. I think in Southeast Asia, well, Indonesia was
Philippines.
Not fully historian, that's my caveat, but as I understand it, the Japanese troops, when they were occupying Indonesia during World War II, basically taught the local Indonesians how to use dynamite or munitions to, it sets off an explosion, it ruptures the swim bladders of the fish that either float to the surface or sink to the bottom, and then they're gathered up. So it's a good way to get a lot of food very quickly, which of course the troops wanted to do, but it's low quality fish because they've been through an explosion. And the bad thing for long-term stability is that it shatters the coral skeletons. And so and we can get into coral biology if you want to, but basically the corals of a coral reef form the structural and ecological foundation of the whole reef ecosystem. So if they've been broken, then that foundation isn't there, and it turns into a very depauperate system. And so it had, by the time I was there, it had evolved not from dynamite, but fishermen actually would make homemade bombs out of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and kerosene, it's basically was the cocktail that was in the Oklahoma City bombing, which is a long time ago. But anyway, that's what people have heard about, that kind of bomb. And so they would put them in Coke bottles or other bottles, and those were the bombs. And most of my work was done in Komodo National Park and Bunaken National Park, where there had just been decades of chronic blasting. So there were these huge rubble fields that basically formed, killing fields for any new coral trying to grow. So I was looking at, did they recover on their own? And if not, were there ways that we could help?
So you mentioned all three, and actually it was the kind of the part of the discussion with Judy last time that led to trying to get you here. Is you have overfishing, destructive fishing, pollution, climate change, and together they create an environment that doesn't just destroy the coral reef, but makes it really difficult for it to bounce back. So some of that sort of natural resiliency that coral has is gone, and it's also more susceptible to parasites and diseases, which then compounds the problem further and further. It's interesting. We tend to forget just how tied in everything is. So you're director of conservation science. How are you working to address all of these issues?
Well, first I'll say we cannot address all of the issues everywhere. That is probably one of the hardest things that we have to do, is thinking about how can we be most strategic about what we're working on. And Judy has actually been helping us with that and really sort of try to come to articulate that much better, sort of our laser-like focus. the Coral Reef Alliance has both field programs and then the conservation science program that I direct. But in the field programs are primarily in Hawaii and then also in the Western Caribbean, mostly Honduras. And they actually have field programs where they are working with local fishers and villages and working to address overfishing and also doing a lot of work around water quality. And Coral was a founding member of the Ocean Sewage Alliance. But so those things are happening in specific geographies. And then what we're doing in the conservation science program is thinking about how can we design conservation interventions or networks of marine protected areas that will help corals survive through climate change. So before my time at Coral, there was some modeling studies that were done that basically looked at climate impacts, corals' ability to evolve, like sort of their adaptive capacity, larval dispersal, and some other components. And basically, what that research found is that by protecting a reef network that includes corals that are already able to survive warmer temperatures and that is well connected across other reef areas so that when corals spawn, they can travel to other areas. That over the long term will enable corals to survive climate change with the important caveat that humanity actually has to get its act in gear and cap carbon emissions and stop the runaway climate change. So they did it in different scenarios. And I don't know if you've talked to them about anything about like the IPCC climate scenarios, like what if it warms this much? What if it warms this much? So in the scenarios where we actually are able to cap emissions and not have runaway global warming, that's when the corals survive. So it's not like we have free reign to just continue to burn oil as much as we want and then corals will be fine. It's very much an intertwined solution.
So in terms of prioritizing, Judy, Helen said you were helping figure that out. Like what is your sort of rubric for making those determinations or advising on how to prioritize the issues?
So yeah, I'm as a member of the board of directors for Coral. When I joined, one of the things that really struck me was there were a lot of different very worthwhile activities, projects going on, and we don't. It's the organization is growing, but don't have the resources to do everything, and really needed to kind of dial in on we're using a model which is the theory of change, and using the strengths of the staff, the team that we have, and the knowledge that we have, that's driving us to be able to focus on the things where the areas where we can actually have impact. So what Helen is doing, that's where we can have an impact. And we have the work we're doing in the communities in the Western Caribbean and in Hawaii and in the places that we're expanding to. That's the work that we're doing there. We have done some work that has been successful in terms of seeing fish rebound and the communities, some of the things we're doing to take care of cleaning the reefs, getting the reefs healthy so that they can be more resilient and the positive impacts from that. So I've been, part of the team or the committee that's been figuring out how we really want to have the most impact with the resources that we have available. And it's been exciting, but it is hard. You have to make some tough choices.
You mentioned the fish biomass and making tough choices. And so I guess you sort of have a goal in mind, like what does it look like when it's really healthy? And prior discussion, so I consider myself sort of a generalist ESG expert. I certainly, like you all, are so far beyond anything I could imagine knowing about in the oceans. But the one area that I have studied because it's fascinating to me is Bikini Atoll. And it just came back. I mean, people stopped messing with it and look at that, like life found a way. When you are trying to, work with your collaborators, work with partners to, and I should caveat, I'm wandering a little, but part of the The problem is the ESG is really, it's got to be human centered. So you can't say stop fishing and stop polluting completely, because this is the consequence of activities that sustain human life. So when you work with, local communities as well as collaborators are coming in to help you, how do you articulate like the goals you're trying to set and show the successes, things like increases in fish biomass and resilience of biodiversity, coral skeletons coming back, things like that?
Helen, do you want to take that one?
Sure,
Yeah.
happy to. So you're absolutely right. I mean, and Coral never comes in and says, okay, this is what you have to do, right? Like the solutions have to be co-created, especially when they impact the community. Um, and so in many cases, it's often just sort of facilitating that dialogue. And oftentimes, I know less about Bikini Atoll, but certainly many parts of the Pacific, for example, have had these customary tenure systems, which did in fact protect the marine environment and allow fish biomass to build up for either lean times or festivals or things like that. And often what the problem is, and so a lot of what we try to do with marine protected areas, there have different names also. There's like territorial use rights for fisheries or marine reserves with fished areas. If you imagine, so often what happens is outsiders are coming in and they are using gear that was never, traditional and a lot heavier, more intensity, right? And so the long-term practices that did for generations sustain communities have basically been taken over by commercialization or expanded beyond what can be supported. So often these efforts are to keep outsiders out, right? So that you let local communities have a bigger share of the pie. And then if you put some areas where you don't fish, the pie actually grows, right? Bigger fish, they spawn more. There's all different sort of cascades. So Atoll is not the only example where if you give nature a chance, it will rebound. There are lots of examples where communities have said, okay, let's do this. And then there are big increases in fish because it's true. You can't say no fishing forever. However, like presumably people also want their children and grandchildren to be able to have livelihoods from the ocean. So it's like, and often it's a matter of, what trade-offs can be made now for the long term.
It's almost like letting land wrap.
Oh, sorry.
So good.
One of the things that we did in Honduras, for example, was when we said we want to put a temporary ban on fishing in an area, had to think it through from top to bottom. So there needed to be enforcement provided so that we knew that the fishing ban would be upheld. But at the same time, we provided another source of protein and we introduced chickens to some of the local communities and helped build hen houses so that they had another source of protein and actually another revenue income source. And so it wasn't saying, no, you can't fish, and so good luck. It was really, we need to see what happens if we stop fishing for a little bit. We want to show you what happens. And then in the meantime, when we're not using fish as the primary protein source, here is another alternative. And that went very well. And I think last week in one of the meetings, it was a 2-month fishing hiatus led to a 600 times increase in fish biomass, which is
just that short.
That's awesome.
2 months.
2 months.
That surprises even me, but that's cool.
Well, that was I was talking with the folks in Honduras last week, and I had them say it twice because I thought my jaw dropped, and they said nope, that's the number. So
amazing. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of like letting the land rest in agricultural concerns. And, I don't know if you guys have watched the Dust Bowl. There's a lot of problems what happened with the Dust Bowl, Ken Burns Dust Bowl, but it's always fascinating to me. First of all, planting the wrong type of crop and then over farming it and what happened there. And so it's very similar that the ocean needs rest too, and for overfishing. And one of the things you said about commercialization, when I was getting ready for this podcast, I was reading through what's threatening corals because it's fascinating. And but one thing that came up that I never really thought of or heard about was coral mining for materials. Can you speak to that? I mean, how big of an issue is that still? And what do people mine corals? Like, what are they mining corals for? I mean, I know the aquarium industry, and all that, but for building, that was very fascinating. So,
Yeah, so that I know most about it actually from a presentation on the Maldives, right? So the Maldives are very low-lying atolls, right? So those islands were literally built by corals, that island chain. But because they were built up by corals, like they don't have mountains or anything like that. So for people to have homes, they would mine the corals and build their houses instead of stones. They would use broken dead coral skeletons. And again, as tourism increased and more people, there was more and more coral mining. So some of those areas have been very damaged by that practice.
and is this still a pretty big practice using coral for habitat
In
or?
some parts of
Yeah.
the world, yes,
Okay.
or for cement or
Okay.
things like that, because it's basically they're skeletons. Coral. So a coral itself, like so, if this is a like you, or you can see in the background, right? Those are
Yeah.
corals. They're just a very thin layer of living tissue. It's basically like little jellyfish. They're related to or sea anemones actually is
Uh,
closer. And so, but they're a colonial animal. So it's like this thin skin of living colonies, and below that is the calcium carbonate skeleton. So that's chemically pretty similar to limestone. So, oftentimes,
okay.
which is like cement. So in parts of the world where where it's the only building material, it does remain an issue.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Oh.
I like that you can really get into the biology and the science of it without speculating. I did want to mention for people listening, if you don't know, Bikini Atoll was the U.S. nuclear test site for a couple of decades, and it's rebounded because no one's allowed to go there because radiation and nuclear fallout and all the things that come with the fun of nuclear test sites. So you're mentioning ways that you have worked with local communities to build resilient ecosystems. Some of the bounce back, even just 2 months of non-fishing apparently has these huge results. I did want to ask about some of the other possible ways that we can work to help restore our waterways. And I know something Judy and I talked about last time that's near and dear to our hearts is the Chesapeake Bay. And I know they've had a whole lot of success with some of the oyster. So they're not artificial oyster beds, but they sort of facilitate these natural oyster communities, and oysters are really good at filtering water. What are some of the other things you all are doing to like encourage or help or facilitate whatever it may be resilient water systems or building back these fisheries or the corals?
That's a question for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, well, and we don't, again, Coral Reef Alliance doesn't work in the Chesapeake, right? We work on coral reefs.
Yeah, that was just my
But
reference point. So
yeah. So, well, Judy mentioned the work in Honduras with the fish closures. We also, the team there worked over a number of years with the communities in West Bay, and there had been a sewage treatment plant that I think had been built but never finished or never hooked up or something like that. But basically, there were a number of issues, so it wasn't being used really. And Coral worked over a number of years with a number of different stakeholders to basically get that up and running and get it improved and get communities hooked up to it. And so it's now done a remarkable job of filtering out the sewage, because that's another whole area of threats that we haven't talked to about in West Bay. And it did such a good job. A, they have data that shows the bacteria counts decreasing, and B, it got certified as a blue flag beach, which is this, certification of basically the cleanliness of the beach. So that's held up as a success story, and now other folks are asking Coral to help provide consultation on how to do this kind of work in other places. That's one example of the kind of work they're doing. I'll give another one from Hawaii. There's a new project that's up and running to restore some of the old fish ponds on Molokai. Again, trying to bring back some of the community wisdom from generations. There's another project that was looking at different ways to reduce sedimentation. So in Hawaii, it has a legacy of talking about agriculture, right? Like really irresponsible agricultural practices. So there are a lot of these old abandoned cane fields, I think it is, with roads that just, again, the land wasn't cared for. And now anytime it rains, brown dirt just basically runs down the mountainside into the water. And that is, basically smothers the corals. So sedimentation is a big challenge. So they were doing some work to see like what different ways to try to stop that flow of sediment. So that was another project that Coral was involved with. Judy mentioned some of the alternative livelihood. In addition to the chickens that she mentioned, they're doing some work on aquaculture. So lots of different things. And then in the science program that I lead, some of the work is around that adaptation that we were talking about and how, like, what are the next steps? And so this ties into the Allen Coral Atlas that you mentioned in my introduction that was originally funded through Vulcan. That was founded by Paul Allen. So who, along with Bill Gates, they co-founded Microsoft. Yep. So then Paul Allen went on to have Vulcan, and he was a big fan of coral reefs, so supported this Allen Coral Atlas partnership, and now it lives with ASU. But anyway, so that exists, and that you should also check out. It's allencoralatlas.org. And through this team approach, went to having the first globally available, globally consistent map of the world's shallow coral reefs. So it has beautiful imagery that came from Planet, and then also benthic and geomorphic habitat classes. And so the question that we're looking at with a bunch of collaborators is, can we use that atlas and other freely available data sets, and can we try to predict what corals would have high genetic diversity? So we've got a whole series of work around that. And then we also, another one of the products recent from the Atlas is the bleaching alerts. And so because coral bleaching, which we haven't even talked about yet, but that's sort of a coral's response. This is now Coral the animal, not Coral Reef Alliance, the organization, to global warming or to warming temperatures or other stresses, is to expel the symbiotic algae that actually give them the color. And so then they turn white. And what you're seeing is that the animal itself isn't dead yet, but it's transparent. So you're seeing that white calcium carbonate skeleton that we looked at. And so those bleached corals, if you are a satellite from space, it is a different color than, a reef that isn't bleached. And so basically the Atlas can do these bleaching alerts. And so someone on my team has been working to try to see, can we field test that? Can we validate that? And also she's just looking in general can the conservation science community do a better job of monitoring the bleaching impacts that are going on.
So this is why it's cool having the scientists. So other than being a signal that the coral's under stress, what does bleaching mean? Like, what, by getting rid of that symbiotic algae, how is that? What's the science behind it? Why is that dangerous?
Well, because the whole symbiosis, the thing that has allowed coral reefs to grow and thrive has been the symbiotic relationship between the coral animal, that little polyp that looks like a sea anemone, and tiny zooxanthellae, which is like a dinoflagellate algae. And so basically a plant. So it's a plant and an animal, and then it makes a rock. So I don't know if you are old enough to have played 20 questions, but there's a
vegetable, mineral.
Vegetable or mineral, and the coral reef is all three. So the plant basically gets nutrients from the animal's poop, the nitrogen and phosphorus. But the plant also photosynthesizes and creates carbon and sugars, and that helps feed the coral. So if those algae are gone and they don't come back, then the corals often starve and die. So the bleaching is a stress response, but it's also a sign that if that stressor doesn't go away, then the coral is likely to die. And it goes from being, a beautiful, vibrant reef to being dead and covered with algae, and then the skeletons break do you
know why they expel the symbiotic algae as a stress response?
Well, so For a while, and so I am a scientist, but I do not stay up on all of the science. I know for a
Mhm.
while it was a question as to whether the algae chose to leave and they're like, it's
Oh,
too hot
okay.
here, we're out of here, or if the corals, as like they're like, oh, we need to get rid of you. Maybe it's absorbing sun. I can't remember. I shouldn't answer because like I can look it up and get back to you, but it is like that's like what that actual mechanism
That's
and
fine.
why it is was a mystery for a while, and I think they've made a fair bit of progress on figuring it out. But I have not stayed on top of it of like exactly what that answer is.
So what can we do once we notice a reef is starting to show bleaching signs?
So I will put a little plug. Coral Reef Alliance put together a comprehensive toolkit and guide of what you can do. There are lots of things, but basically the number one answer is you should try to think in advance and try to have a coordinated plan in place. It's important to do monitoring. It's important to try to get the word out because the biggest thing that humans can do to try to prevent bleaching is to get a handle on climate change, right? And so there are other things that can be done, like to reduce non-bleaching stressors. So, for example, many places give reefs a break from scuba diving or a break from fishing, right? Because, and Judy had this good analogy like if you're run down, you could pick up any cold, whereas if you're healthy, you don't. So, like the same sort of thing, the reef is sick. So, let's try to reduce the other stressors. Those are some of the things that you can do in the short term. And then in the longer term, it's important to fight for, global decarbonization, basically.
Yeah, speaking of things we can do, sorry, Rob.
Oh, good. After
Speaking of
you.
things we can do, what can individuals do that love to go to the ocean and swim or snorkel around coral? I think one thing I was watching the other day was even sunscreen. The sunscreen that you use can be a stressor on the coral reefs. I mean, there's things like individuals like, hey, you're going to go to the ocean for a week, you're going to do some snorkeling. Our family loves to do that. What are some little things that you can do
So,
besides not polluting and that type
right.
of stuff?
And,
Yeah,
voting with your like
yeah,
environmental things and
right, right.
lobbying your oil executives and things like
Yeah,
that. So
yeah,
those are the big
yeah,
things and
yeah, yeah.
corporations. But yeah, little things. So there are reef friendly sunscreens. Some of the chemicals in some sunscreens are indeed toxic to coral. So for sure you should do that. Um, think about what you eat, right? So there are like lots of people like to go and eat seafood, but there are fish that you can eat that are more or less damaging, or you could eat more vegetarian, right? Like, so there's some dietary choices have a big impact. You could also think about the flying that you do. So that has, flights are a pretty big carbon contributor. So instead of going on 5 trips a year to 5 different places, maybe go to fewer trips and stay longer, right? So just like think about there's a lot of different things that individuals can do with their choices that all add up. And again, this is I have heard that like it's almost like that focus on what can the individual do, like that's almost like a smokescreen that large corporations do to escape the responsibility that they have.
Mhm.
Well, and that's one of the things about to bring it back to ESG, right? Is so for so long it's just sort of treated as like, oh, you don't have to worry about what the corporations are doing. So like I think yes, there are things that individuals can do, and I think it's important to think about the larger scale corporate responsibilities.
Yep, yep.
That actually dovetails in the question I was about to ask Judy is we talk about the forest and the trees, and we've talked a lot about the trees today and the getting down into the individual levels. But when we talk about the business side of it and ESG metrics as sort of a way to look at the advancement of things in the sustainability realm, how much do you see ESG metrics either currently being able to play a role in driving progress or eventually playing a role in driving progress and protecting coral reefs?
Great question. And I'm so glad you asked. I'd love to talk about it. Fortunately, I think there's a lot of pressure slash support. So whether it's coming from within an organization or if it's coming down onto, a corporation, doesn't really matter. But there's a lot of pressure to become sustainable. So some of the main industries I think that we think about with maritime environments is really shipping and, let's say, fishing. So if we start with shipping, and I don't mean UPS, I mean marine transport, big. So it's I thought this was interesting. I actually didn't know this before, but of the global annual emissions, the greenhouse gases, marine transport is responsible for between 3 and 4%. So big chunk just right there. And so not everybody's on board with cleaning up their act, but there's a lot of progress in a lot of areas. One of the issues you have with both shipping, fishing, and anything to do with maritime is you get into international law. You don't have it's harder just in the United States to get anything passed, and then you try and get other countries to all collaborate, and nobody wants to really own the problem, and it's a challenge. But so with shipping, there's the different kinds of pollution that you have. You have that we've already talked about a little bit, the water pollution, air pollution, the fuel that is used for most shipping puts off a lot of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, I think, and nitrous. I mean, a lot of stuff and particulates. So there's a lot of progress being made on working toward developing cleaner fuels. And some of the solutions or the changes are actually technological or evolutionary, changing the fuel types, changing the design of the ships to be more sustainable. And some of it is very fundamental. For example, if they don't run as fast, if you just slow down, they put out a lot less pollution. So that doesn't work if you're carrying lettuce, but maybe we'll get to a point where we don't need to ship lettuce 6,000 miles. I don't know. That's a bold thought, but I'll throw it out there. There's a whole new realm of technological development in sails. So there's a lot of jokes about, going back in time, new materials and new designs for sails. There's capturing the wind. If you're out on high seas, if we can get some of our power from the wind, then that's clean energy. So there's a lot of work going on, a lot of research going on, perhaps not enough. And I would love to put the accelerator to a lot of it. Some of the leading companies like Maersk, Danish company, Danes have a lot of leading companies in the environmental realm. I think in ESG, really the E is the thing that jumps out the most, but we shouldn't forget the S, because if we get labor practices and safety is a huge issue in any maritime activity. So some of the companies like Maersk are doing a lot holistically in it, not just a check the box thing, but really doing it as part of who they are. In terms of, let's see, air pollution, water pollution, obviously, the use of plastics and
I'm pretty sure fishing, like the massive fish industries and nets, are the source of like 70% of ocean plastic. It's
it's way up there, I think. And that Great Pacific garbage patch, I think half that is fishing nets. So the figure, taking responsibility for the garbage you create is really a very fundamental thing that we need to somehow. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we can get the regulatory support for. There's a lot of illegal fishing that still goes on, and it's hard to maintain and really improve in some areas. But I think if you realize that half that garbage patch is fishing nets, if we could cut that down by half, cut it down by a third legally. I mean, improvement is what we need to get. We can't get to zero and perfection right away. But if we make really good progress, that's, I think, what we can hope for. So there are quite a few companies that are doing a lot in the shipping realm. One of the other things I think that is another factor that has to do with slowing down the speed of shipping, and maybe Helen, you want to talk more about this too, but the acoustic, the noise pollution. So many marine animals rely on sonar to communicate with each other. Whales talk to each other, but they also use echolocation to find their food and to find each other. And it's so noisy with all the shipping traffic, they can't hear each other and they can't hear anything. So I think the whole sustainability movement for the shipping line is also including improvements in the ways that the ships are built so that they run more quietly and reduce the noise pollution.
Did you see there was
Mm.
a paper published, I want to say last week, maybe the week before, that they have actually delineated like whales have an actual language, like there are
You can
verbs and
tell what
nouns.
they're from families, and they know what they reach out, they communicate with each other and identify what clan you're in.
It's
It's
Beautiful.
I'm halfway
amazing.
through. Yeah, it's amazing. Like
Hmm.
it's a simple language, but it is a real language with like he went here. Like
And I'm from the Shining Sun family. And who are you? You know, I mean, they can, when there's a new creature that comes along, they want to know what clan you're part of. That's amazing. And but it's very stressful. So we talked about the stressors on the reefs. There's also obviously the stressors on the animals within the reefs. So companies that are doing, things to improve that. The other part that, as you know, that's near and dear to my heart is that ESG is good for business. Good business. A company that is good at ESG is also a good company in terms of its P&L. And so some of the things in the shipping world, for example, they're realizing if they load a ship more effectively, they reduce the amount of fuel they use dramatically. So balancing the weight and filling it, making, like as Helen said, fewer flights for your vacation, but also fewer trans-Pacific or transatlantic ships. Make sure it's a packed full ship. With respect, going back one more time to that slow shipping speeds, I can say it. That's kind of one of those little
3 times fast.
yeah. But the last couple of years, ships have raced across the Pacific to get to LA, and they're outside the Los Angeles harbor for days,
uh
waiting for the opportunity to go in and unload. So if they just ship the themselves over there a little more slowly, there's less wait time. And so it doesn't cost money to be traveling more slowly because they were spending that same amount of time. It's just they're not sitting outside waiting for a space in the harbor to open up. So I think that's something interesting that the companies that are really thinking ahead are looking at all those types of things and really doing a lot with the logistics and the routing because there's a lot of cost efficiencies that can be made by doing that. So being smarter about that. With respect to fishing, fishing as an avid scuba diver like Helen, I've been in the water actually when they've been blasting in the Philippines. Um,
Wow.
yeah, down below. They also do it with smaller doses, at least in the Philippines. It's to get to stun the fish to then use them for aquariums for to ship internationally. Helen, I don't
Hmm.
know if you were.
I thought that was usually cyanide for that they
Okay,
did
that might.
cyanide fishing
Well,
for the aquarium industry. But maybe
is that
also
right?
maybe a
Maybe it's
stun for
not.
the
Okay,
doesn't
we might
sound good
well
either
then.
way.
I'll defer to you.
no,
Yeah.
also not good.
I was yeah, both. I'm
Yeah,
like,
I'll
oh
defer to
wow.
you on
Yeah.
that one. But
Uh,
yeah, so the
yeah.
fishing, well, one of the big issues with fishing is we are fishing too much. People can't see it, but there are a lot of people, we are overfishing our planet so rapidly. We have a lot of key species that are either endangered or getting close to endangered. And I think because it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and we just eat it. And I don't want to say, I like fish, I like to eat fish. So I know it doesn't work to just say, well, don't ever eat any. I think substituting some is great, looking for sustainable ones. I mean, Helen mentioned that. The Monterey Bay Aquarium lists the currently sustainable fish choices that are the wisest, most earth friendly choices that you can make. So, as individuals, we can do that. But at the large scale, some of the ways that we're fishing are incredibly destructive. And so, leading companies are doing away with those ways. So, things like gill netting or long line fishing. So,
Or
this is
bottom
where
trawling is something else that's terrible.
what it the
Bottom trawling,
oh
basically dragging across the
harvest. I was going to
seafloor.
say yes. So the way
Hmm.
shrimp is harvested, you basically take kind of like what you drag along behind a tractor in a farm, and you drag it along the bottom of the ocean and you harvest the fish and harvest the shrimp and whatever else comes up with that. And the same time, and so you just destroyed that section of the reef to get the shrimp.
Or I'll say the other way they harvest shrimp. So there's that, or you cut down all the mangroves, which are hugely important coastal ecosystem, and you make a shrimp farm and over chemical, basically you farm it very intensively and then you abandon it and move on to the next because it can't sustain, similar to what you were saying about the needing to rest, right? So the shrimp often is not great to eat for the environment.
It's not, and I do like shrimp, but it is one of the most harvesting shrimp, getting that shrimp is one of the most environmentally destructive things that we can be eating, I think. But the long lines or the gill netting, I mean, the long lines can be, so you're putting out a fishing line that can be 60 miles long. And anything that comes along that gets caught in it, or a gill net, is like a wall. And so anything gets caught. And so the issue is bycatch. So you're hoping to get tuna, but you've gotten all these sharks and dolphins and sea turtles, and then hundreds of thousands of seabirds. And so there's nothing they can do with the bycatch. So changing the way, not necessarily going back in time, but adjusting the way, getting rid of some of the really destructive current fishing methods, I think is an important thing. And the leading companies who are doing a lot with ESG, like Trident Seafoods and Highliner is a Canadian company. They don't use the long lines. They don't use gill nets. They use more sustainable methods. And so they're doing well as far as their profits and loss and their growth. And they're also very focused on their role as stewards of the ocean and protectors of their employees. They have really high safety standards. And so there are some companies that are strong ESG leaders in the marine oriented industries. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that word stewardship. I think that brings it back to how do we take care of the natural beauty that we've been given. And I think it's really about balance too, right? How do you balance all this out and give the ocean a chance to keep producing what it's been producing? And so I think the arguments about, oh, that's overblown. I tell people, go to the parts of the world where you can see this trash, right? Go to the parts of the world where it's I just came back from overseas to a part of the world where it's like, wow, the pollution in the water is insane. And I don't know, I mean, it's bad for people's health, right? It's bad for the environment. And I think a lot of Americans, I'm not trying to love America, proud American, but I think we don't see our trash necessarily or see our effects. So it's out of sight, out of mind versus, wow, it's really going to start catching up with us. And so stewarding things and companies that are stewarding things, I think is so important for their bottom line and just for the benefit of the common good for everybody. So yeah, that's great.
Well, and that reminds me.
Yeah. Knowing they're doing that. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say back to your question, Nate, about what can individuals do? Like, that is part of the investment, right? Like, you could invest in ESG, and I'm just myself personally. Like, my father unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, and had a bit of an inheritance, and we needed a financial planner for the first time, and we specifically went with somebody who basically did ESG, and so now that is a much bigger part of our portfolio than it was before, because again, that's something individuals can do, but it sends signals to the corporations.
Yep. That's the entire backdrop of this podcast.
That's what I figured.
But you all talk about fishing methods. One last question, because I do want to be conscious of your time. One controversial potential solution is fishing farms. Can you talk a little bit more about the upsides and the downsides of fish farms?
You can add more, but like often it's downsides, right? Like again, thinking about, so shrimp farming, we already mentioned the huge negative impacts to mangroves. Salmon farming is another.
I know salmon farming is really bad.
Yeah, exactly. Because like fish are not meant to be in that huge high density. And so in order for them to not get sick, there has to be huge use of antibiotics. They like, all the fish poop downstream has impact. So I think there are probably some small scale. Oh, also, I'm thinking about tilapia farming has really big negative environmental impact. So like I am not aware, and maybe Judy is, of fish farming that has been done without having a pretty big negative impact. I know that maybe is a growth area, like they talk about open water fish farming or something like that. So I think I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it would be far better for humans to just in general say, you know what, I don't need to eat. It's not never, like Judy was saying, I don't need to never eat beef because that's not good either. The solution isn't to just like I'm gonna have a steak. It's to like maybe I'll have vegetarian more nights a week. Things like that. So.
I think yeah, going back to Nate's question, what can individuals do? I think if we would stop wasting so much, what we have could feed a lot more of us and last a lot more. So the single-use plastics has been something that drives me nuts. When if we would just put a tax on every water bottle that or something that makes it so it's not so dang convenient to buy or grab a case of water bottles from Costco or something. Really just fill up your own water bottle and carry it. Single-use plastics they're so destructive in so many ways, but at the same time, we have a lot of food waste. And I think if we wouldn't buy stuff that we don't end up eating, if we would just be a little smarter about it and not be so overload over the top on it. But I think we could do degrees of improvement, maybe 25% improvement. Think about how much and I waste, and I hate it when I do that. So I'm not saying that I have not perfected that as my answer, but doing a little more meal planning and getting a lot less food waste makes the food go around a lot further if we would be doing that.
Absolutely. Yep.
The other thing, it was funny. One of the other areas that I have sort of a mixed feeling about, but cruise ships, that industry is still exploding. I really thought after COVID, people wouldn't necessarily want to get on a cruise ship with 20,000 other people in those quarters, but it's grown. And for a lot of people, I mean, it's a great way to go. You unpack your suitcase once, you've got this traveling home for a week. And so one of the things I did want to mention was actually Carnival Cruise Lines is a cruise company that is genuinely focused on improving its sustainability. They're doing everything from they've dramatically reduced their use of single-use plastics. They're doing things to reduce food waste and then reuse food waste. And they're making their ships efficient. They're looking at hybrid fuels, even some biodiesel, looking at biomass. So as far as ESG leaders and companies to think about when you want a diversified portfolio of investments, they're one that really deserves, I think, consideration. They've replaced all the lighting in their ships with LED lighting to reduce the energy costs of operating. And there are a lot of things. There's a lot of improvements that can be made that don't mean people have to give things up. You can still have everything you have now and be using a fraction of the energy that you're using in, say, an older version of a certain cruise ship. So wanted to throw that out there too.
Well, that's important too, because I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, you're trying to take things away from me." I'm like, no, we're trying to keep the same things, but just be smarter about it and more efficient. So yeah, I'm glad you said that. So
What about, have either of you heard of anything? Because I know China just opened the world's first Gen 4 nuclear reactor. Have you heard about nuclear powered shipping at all?
Not in shipping, no.
Well, they use it in aircraft carriers, which is interesting. But most use aircraft carriers, and submarines are nuclear powered. So, they can go forever. So, yeah, who knows? I don't know. But
you have to get another guest for that one.
Fair enough.
Yeah. That's all I know about that. So, yeah, great.
Look, I really, really appreciate you both coming on. I love getting into the science of it. And Nate and I talk a lot about stop politicizing this stuff. Like, like we can have minor political arguments about the best way to get somewhere, but we should all be on the same side about where we need to go. And I really, really appreciate both of you being able to come in and sort of where the rubber meets the road, if you will. If you will forgive my cliches, I'm feeling a little under the weather. So,
Well, this has been exciting because I love the whole ocean thing is so, our family loves to snorkel. I have family members that scuba. I haven't gotten there yet, but when I have more time in my hands, I definitely want to get scuba certified. But just
You
even
do. You do.
snorkeling in parts of the world and being able to see such, amazing nature, I didn't grow up doing that. And so doing that in adulthood has just really opened my eyes to a lot of that. And, cleaning up plastic as we go along, if we see it and seeing certain places that are really good about keeping their beaches clean and others that could do a lot more, so it's something that we're definitely passionate about in my household. So I do have one last question, Rob. I do want to apologize. I think
absolutely.
Judy asked you this last time, but favorite dive. I don't remember what you said last time on our podcast, but Judy, your favorite dive, and then Helen, your favorite dive, or part of the world to dive in.
Oh, favorite part of the world to that. Well, so my pat answer to that, where my
Yeah,
favorite dive is usually the last dive I had. So,
it's a good answer. That's a good
I'm
one.
just
Yeah.
happy in the water.
Yeah.
But Indonesia
Yeah.
is probably one of my favorite places in the world. I love Maldives too, since Helen mentioned
Yeah.
Maldives. But Indonesia has amazing biodiversity and
Yeah.
it's just beautiful, and the Indonesian people are wonderful.
Yeah,
Nice.
I have not traveled the world to dive so much. Most of my diving has been for research diving, but I will
Mm.
agree with Judy. Indonesia is an amazing country for coral reefs and lots of other
Wow.
biodiversity, and there are a lot of challenges too. So it's hopefully grappling with that. But yeah, some great diving there.
Great.
But
All right.
before we sign off, what is y'all? What's the message you want to get out to everyone listening?
Well, I'd like to. I just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not really important. I'm so glad you guys are in the water and you see the beauty of the oceans.
Mhm.
But we need to take care of our oceans, and there's a lot each of us can do as individuals that doesn't take away from our life, but can make the planet a little bit better. And it would be great if we would just do a little bit more of those good things that we know we can do.
I would certainly agree with that. And I probably would not be doing my job for the Coral Reef Alliance if I didn't mention, like, our executive director just sent out an email yesterday or today that we have a matching gift to the end of the year. So
Hmm.
if people want to go to coral.org/donate, there's, it's end of year giving. And so that's, I do think that we are doing good work. We are focusing on science solutions, thinking about the long term. So that's something else that people can do is support organizations that are doing good work.
And that's what it really comes down to. I mean, every every little thing we do has an impact, but when you start to scale that up, when you look at country and corporate level, it has a massive impact, and that impact has knock-on effects for all of us. Scientists are coming up with scientific solutions. Science is never settled. I think that's very important. When you read the papers, these are suggestions, you point out harms, but then we get to things that we're like, this is pretty simple. When coral is bleached, for example, it means it's a stressor, and there are these things that are affecting that, and we have ways to address that now. We have companies that you can invest in that are taking this seriously. You don't have to change your way of life. You don't have to spend more. You just have to willing to put in a little time and research. Um, Judy and Helen, thank you so much. It's I love being
Yeah.
around people smarter than I am and just learning stuff and getting it back. So thank you for coming on. Hopefully we'll get you on again next year and maybe with some good news about where things are going. For everyone else listening, communications at owlesg.com for questions, feedback, and all your hate mail. Remember to like and subscribe and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.